Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for getting up early and being in situ in time. We're absolutely delighted to welcome you to our event today, Pandemics, Climate Conflict, Preventing Future Shocks, here on the margins of the UN General Assembly. My name is Eloise Todd, and I'm the Executive Director and co-founder of Pandemic Action Network, and I'm honoured to be moderating this very important discussion today in partnership with the Independent Panel for Pandemic Preparedness and Response and Resilience Action Network Africa. Complex shocks are an increasing feature of our world. With health and pandemic threats, we've seen a continental and international public health emergency called with Mpox, and H5N1 continues to spread and evolve. Ever greater climate and environmental pressures are having an increasing impact on human health, the spread of disease, and the risk of zoonotic spillover. And the devastating conflicts in Ukraine, Gaza, and elsewhere around the world are leading to the loss of life, people forced to move and leave their homes, and the spread of disease. Pandemic threats, climate, and conflict are weaving together to create increasingly complex challenges. So how can multilateral cooperation help us address these challenges, and what progress, if any, will be made this week, and what can we do in future to strengthen that? So it gives me absolute pleasure to introduce our extremely distinguished first panel. To dive into this discussion, I'm honoured to introduce Her Excellency Helen Sirleaf, former President of Liberia and former co-chair of the Independent Panel and member of the Elders. The Right Honourable Helen Clark, former Prime Minister of New Zealand, former co-chair of the Independent Panel and member of the Elders. Zaid Ra'ad Al Hussein, former High Commissioner for Human Rights and member of the Elders. President Juan Manuel Santos, former President of Colombia and member of the Elders. And David Miliband, President and CEO of the International Rescue Committee and former member of the Independent Panel and former UK Foreign Secretary. So thank you so much to all of you for being with us here today. President Sirleaf, the Mpox situation is unfolding now, and there are emerging H5N1 threats in the US and beyond. Learning from both Ebola and COVID-19, what are the international cooperation mechanisms that we need to address these kinds of crises?
Thank you, and good morning to all. Let me start by putting this in a broader context. I think today we see an evolving world. We see one in which there's so many uncertainties and complexities. We have a situation where we're facing the difficulties and the results of wars that are going on. And so we need to see whatever we do in trying to address the health crisis within this broader context. We're now going through meetings that have to do with within the climate, the Summit of the Future. And that summit roaring call is for reform. It's for reform of the global financial architecture. It's formed for peace and security arrangements. And we also see, going back to my own continent, Africa, where we do find that democracy is now unwavering. We have a situation where the health threat has become much more intense because of the failure of global cooperation. What do we do about this? I believe we can look at the example we had in Liberia when 3 West African countries faced Ebola. We knew that our health systems did not have the capacity or the resources to respond. And we also knew that because we have large rural areas, we had to do something differently. In that respect, we determined to put ourselves together in an all-in-one reaction, all-in-one push to resolve the crisis. And we gave the leadership of our effort into the hands of the rural community. And this meant identifying those who could determine the symptoms, those who could be the first responders to it, And this is why we spent a lot of time working on community health workers. Today, we believe that is the formidable force that has been able to respond to COVID-19. And as a result, we think that we were able to find the right responses so that we were not as affected by COVID-19. And that was done in the context of the fact that, again, we did not get the international response for that in many ways because of global cooperation that had been undermined. Well, what do we do now, I believe, is to see how, based upon the pact that has been negotiated, is how do we now find the way to look at the report that was done by the independent panel for pandemic prevention response. Until today, we have not been able to get the full agreement that's been required. We've called for a Global Health Threats Council. We've called for different responses in ensuring that we are able to have, as we did in the case of COVID and Ebola, where one had a platform in which you could use that to bring all the parties together for the therapeutics, for the responses to ensure that we're able to have effective response. And we must do this because it's clear if you look at what's now happening with the mpox, that until we can find a way, we will not be able to respond globally to another pandemic. And I think we all at this point has to know that what it relies on is the political will. How do we get the political leaders to see the importance of being able to address this? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Helen Clark, there seems to be this fundamental disconnect between the spoken desire of countries and leaders to coordinate and the reality of what it would take to be successful as it plays out. How can we incentivize leaders and countries to inject some political urgency to get that political will into these issues, and crucially, the connectedness between them? And how can we get action to match the rhetoric?
It needs what the elders have termed to be long view leadership, where you see these range of basically existential threats coming at you. And if you try and pick away at them one by one, it won't be as effective as setting up mechanisms which enable you to take a more holistic view. And that's why many of us were quite attracted by the proposal the Secretary General floated around the emergency platform of seeing that you needed some mechanism which could have had a leader-led component advising him associated with it, which would be in a position ideally not just to respond to a particular event, but to take a longer view look at what was needed to support the global community to build more resilience to these sort of cascading impacts of the complex threats. I mean, several years ago, Partnership for Maternal, Newborn and Child Health, which I chair, said, you know, we've got this 3 Cs crisis. We've got COVID, we've got climate, we've got conflicts, and they all kind of, you know, build on each other in the human misery that they cause. But you know, it's the same as always, I think, with the UN level negotiations here. There's many grand statements in the Pact for the Future. You know, the leaders will end hunger and food insecurity. They will protect all civilians in armed conflict. They will achieve gender inequality. They will reform the Security Council, but the how is left as a very, very big question. And I think the best we can read into it, because it's always best to see a glass half full, is that there's quite a lot of hooks on this that could be built on with determined cross-regional diplomacy. But the how is pretty much missing at the moment. As I said, with respect to the emergency platform, that really didn't excite the member states too much at all. And in some ways, I think it was one of those proposals where might have been better just to go and do it rather than ask for permission. Because if you ask for permission and then there's no enthusiasm, it's harder to revive it. So use the soft power of the office of the SG to get something going. But we've now ended up with an action 54 of the Pact for the Future, where what they've agreed is the Secretary General will consider approaches to strengthen the UN system's response, but then there's just about every caveat and creation around it, as long as you don't tread on the toes of any other agency or mechanism. So I think we're left a bit hanging by the Pact for the Future on the capacity to respond to the complex shocks. The shock like the pandemic, no one agency could ever deal with that. It needs more coordination than a single agency can bring. But look, nil desperandum. There are hooks which can be built on, but it will need people to keep that interest going. And as we've noted before at panels like this in recent years, with pandemics, there's the cycle of panic and neglect. Helen lived through this with Ebola. Total panic with cause, but then kind of, oh, well, that was that. We get on, and the countries who are at the eye of the storm are still left with a huge recovery job. So we just have to keep at it, I think, and encouraging the missions who, but presumably there's some forward process elaborated for what you do now with this pact and these dozens of actions which don't really have any clear way of implementing them at this stage.
Thanks, Helen. Zaid, thinking about some of what Helen said there about the UN processes, and you've been following the pandemic accord closely, and in your position of Human Rights Commissioner of the UN, you've got this knowledge of how the UN really works. So how do you think those frameworks and tools can be designed to better deliver on what the world deeply needs, this effective cooperation and multilateralism? Over to you.
Well, thank you, Eloise. Yes, monitoring the IMB negotiations has made me age faster than I otherwise would have wanted. So my response will come in three parts. The first part deals with ugliness. The second part deals with the good. And then the third part, the better. The first part, the ugliness. Multilateral negotiation is a craft. It's an art form. People who are not practiced in it will find it extremely difficult to do. You can't just bring 193 countries and say, negotiate. There are hundreds of years of experience built into how you do it. Right? And the critical part of any multilateral negotiation is speed. You have to roll the text out every night. You have to keep feeling for different positions. You speak to the stakeholders constantly, and you don't give time for capitals to keep putting the knife in. So watching the IMB closely, I mean, it was at some stages so comical and tragic. If it wasn't so serious, you'd think that Benny Hill would walk onto the stage at WHO. I mean, it was just ridiculous. Their text is rolled out. There's no explanation of it. They kept chopping and changing the modalities. They went to drafting group, put the text up, brought the text down. I mean, it was a shambles, a clear shambles, all the way through to probably IMB 9. But there were moments which were really interesting, as all of you who are following the negotiations know this. And what was more remarkable, so that's the ugly. The good part is that the people involved, the negotiators themselves, and for all of you who have followed this at WHO, are really exceptional. I mean, on an individual basis, they're amazing. They know the material really well. There are many potential bridge builders, and they have to be made and allowed to work, which is to negotiate the text directly between themselves and not be manacled by a process, which is what you're alluding to, which doesn't work, manifestly doesn't work, or didn't work, and it did not deliver a text by WHA 77. So I say it's less to do with the political or lack of political backing, and just the simple technique or not so simple technique, the sophisticated technique of negotiating treaties was sort of hitherto unknown. The good news, or the better news, is that since WHA 77, so IMB 10 and 11, there now seems to be a sense of purpose. The Bureau has organized itself. They seem to know how to structure the meetings properly. The negotiations now are on a serious keel. The issues are still difficult, of course. Article 12 and PAPS is still a major issue at stake. We still have a deep, deep distrust between the African group in particular and Group for Equity and the high-income countries. That is absolutely clear. And I think the point you were raising, when I went and attended the WHO Regional Committee meeting in Brazzaville just before IMB 11, we were told that Nigeria had only recently received its first batch of Mpox vaccine 2 years after it had requested them. So clearly we have the problem is there. So for us now, before IMB 12 and what may come after, the repair has to be made. We have to bring the groups together. That has to be the cardinal sort of wedge that we need to sort of drive into this process. And they have to be able to speak, and they have to be able to be constructive. But my final point, and I can ask anyone here, see if they know the answer. If you look at the IMB process, we've had a technical briefing on every part of the pathogen access and benefit sharing scheme, right? Going back to the Convention on Biological Diversity, Nagoya Protocol, the PIP, we've gone through all of it, and BBNJ. So every aspect, including TRIPS and the time-bound waivers and all of them. Not one briefing on what equity means. Not one. And if you go deep into the literature, it's hardly surprising, because there is no single clear definition on what it means. In economics, it means one thing. In law, it sort of means another. Everyone uses it. I mean, there isn't a panel I've been on this week where it hasn't been used by every single speaker. But you ask them, what do you mean by it? And everyone's sort of interpreting it differently. And we have to sort of repair that if we're going to fix PAPS, which means we might have an instrument under Article 19 and then get this through. And that's where I think we need to go. The idea that, well, equity basically means Article 12. You sort out the sort of access and benefit sharing, it's equity. Well, we know from the African group, it's not entirely like that simple, right? Even though the PAPS was their proposal, and they put it when they put it forward, and it was responded to by the European Union. So there is a clear opportunity, and I hope we can make it work. And I hope the negotiators, all of whom are very talented, will be able to make it work.
Thank you so much for those perspectives. President Santos, if we could go back to the Pact for the Future, I'd love to hear your views on that and the outcomes of this week. And also to hear your views on the overarching issue that we have with conflict, climate, and pandemics, which is this overarching finance question. How do we entice investment in prevention, which is much cheaper than cure? And we talked about finance last year, and last year you gave us the love budget. So the need to invest in budgets of love and kindness. So we're hoping for similar inspiration this year.
Thank you. And the love budget that I mentioned a year ago was simply the theory that leaders express their preferences, their love in the budget. And it is evident that love this past year in terms of pandemics has been quite scarce. We haven't seen that love at all. Now, you were asking the impact of the Pact for the Future and how can we be more effective in prevention, which is by far the most effective way to address any problem, any public policy. On the Pact for the Future, as always, you can see it both ways. I was, and many of us was very skeptic about the possibility of reaching a pact just a couple of weeks ago. And the fact that it was reached, even though we had that very interesting procedure of Russia being defeated, but the pact finally was approved and we have it. Watered down, that's the cost of the theory of consensus and this multilateral negotiations. It was watered down in aspects like the one you mentioned, the link between security and climate. That I think is, there's no logical reason to have done that. I had the opportunity of going to the Security Council and asking the Security Council to get involved with climate for a simple, very common sense reason. Climate change is producing more and more conflicts in the world. And if the UN and the Security Council were created to avoid conflicts, therefore, they should get involved in resolving climate change and conflict. But no, because of geopolitical reasons and different reasons, it was rejected. Going back to the Pact for the Future, the good news is we have a pact and we have a list of actions, and we should take advantage of that in order to hopefully, and this has been mentioned, create a synergy. We have the COP16 in Colombia next month. And we have the COP29 and then the COP30 in Brazil. Many of us have been insisting on merging the COPs. There's no reason whatsoever to have two COPs. If we don't address the problem of biodiversity, the fight against climate change is useless, and vice versa. If you're not effective in fighting climate change, the biodiversity will simply disappear. The same with pandemics. And instead of merging the two COPs, they should also merge the WHO or the negotiations for a solution to the pandemics. It's all the same problem. They're very much interrelated. They depend on each other. And that's one of the things that has to be better understood. And there I go to prevention. Why are leaders so indifferent sometimes to the simple, also very logical fact that to invest in prevention is much more profitable than to cure whatever you are addressing, be it a disease or be it a drought or whatever. Prevention is always more effective. But why don't they do that? Political reasons and short-term vision. It's not politically profitable to spend your money preventing. It's much more profitable to spend your money constructing something that you can show. And that's where you need, and this is called what we are calling the elders. And David, you can also become an elder. and I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. When I was
I want to be young still.
no, but I was.
Let's start the youngsters.
No. I'll tell you why. 6 years ago, when I was asked to become an elder, I remember I was in Madrid and they came and do you want to become an elder? And I said, an elder? I'm not that old. And he said, no, no, no. Mandela said, the elders were the wise man. And so you're a wise man. Anyway, the elders, we have this mantra, long-term, bold leadership. And that is what we need. And that long-term, bold leadership needs, also means, and a good leader needs to teach, to convince, to persuade. And at this moment, we really have to have a big effort in that direction. Leaders who are able to convince their electorate, to convince whoever is fighting for example, the pandemics, that preventing is much more effective. How much is the pandemic going to cost? I think the numbers are $38 trillion in the next year, accumulated cost of the pandemics. Any finance minister sees that and says, my God, this is crazy. We have to invest in prevention. So we truly need that long-term bold leadership that can also convince people that the problems are interrelated, and they're more and more interrelated as time goes by. And we are faced also with another factor, the urgency of what we need to do, the urgency. We're hearing in this week that we have less than 6 years to reverse the trend in climate change. Less than 6 years. And I heard a couple of days ago an expert in AI that we have less than 2 years to domesticate AI. 2 years. So there's a sense of urgency, and therefore that's why that bold long-term leadership is needed now more than ever.
Thank you so much. Over to you, David, head of the youngsters. At the IRC, you've got vast experience dealing with the human consequences of conflict. Can you tell us a bit about how climate change and the increasing risk of epidemic and pandemic threats is changing your work? And what are your solutions for the state of international cooperation now in the context of these increasing global threats?
Well, thank you very much, Eloise. It's a great honor to be here with all of my teachers here, genuinely honored on behalf of the International Rescue Committee to be here. I think the pandemic showed many things, but 3 that I want to highlight. 1, it showed just how connected the world is. Secondly, it showed that we're only as strong as the weakest link in the chain. And thirdly, it showed how inequality will be grown and exacerbated as global risks strike. And it seems to me that's the essential conundrum that we have to face, or that we face in my organization. 16 countries that are in conflict are also in the top quartile of climate vulnerability under the Notre Dame Index. And that's something that various of the previous speakers have referred to. There's a statistic that brings it out. The nexus of conflict and climate crisis is growing. 43% of the world's extreme poor live in just those 16 countries. 80% of the people in humanitarian need live in those countries. And what we're facing at the moment is rising global risks in an interconnected world that exacerbates inequality. And until we're able to address that, sorry, I'm talking about inequality, not equities aid, but it's the inequality that's growing and that needs to be mitigated and addressed. And it seems to me that we shouldn't allow our leaders to get away with the suggestion that there aren't answers out there. We know that inclusive health systems are more protected. We know that anticipatory action is more effective, but only 1 country in the world dedicates a target for a percentage of its humanitarian budget to be on anticipatory action. Only Germany says that 5% of its humanitarian budget will be on anticipatory action. And then just to pick up something that President Sirleaf said, was I think it's incredibly important. We also know that community health workers, just to take the health sector as an example, you don't need, the top priority is not to train more doctors with PhDs. The top priority is to train more community health workers. And our leaders too often make the problems seem more complicated rather than less complicated. There are solutions there, and we shouldn't allow them to get away with the excuse that they don't know what to do. Now, I just want to address your final point about the global situation today. And I think there's a real danger that those of us who believe in the multilateral system, and I know that all of my teachers here on the panel believe in the multilateral system, and in a way, all of you who are here, almost by definition, you believe in the multilateral system. But there's a danger that those of us who believe in the multilateral system feel we need to make excuses for its lack of effectiveness. I think that's a real danger. The alternative to the Pact for the Future is not to blow up the UN system, but that cannot lead us, I would submit, to say that the Pact for the Future is adequate. Just to take one example, the Secretary General proposed an emergency platform. It's not a threatening idea. It's not a dangerous idea. It's not a very radical idea. If you said to a member of the public, if you stopped someone in New York City or any other city in the world and asked them, should there be an international emergency platform that's ready to respond to crises, they'll say, well, why doesn't one exist already? Now, the independent panel on which I was honored to serve said, for goodness sake, have we learned nothing? It must be an emergency preparedness and response platform. But the emergency platform got zeroed out of the text. Got sort of precision missile, took it out of the text. And I think we have to call that out. I think it's dangerous if we don't call it out, because it allows those who are leading to the lowest common denominator or those who are exceeding in the lowest common denominator to get away with it. So number one, I think we have to call out inadequate response. But secondly, I also think we have to say to those leaders and those countries who want to do more, I think we should say, do it. Don't allow the excuse that not everyone has agreed to stop things being done. And the phrase coalition of the willing for all sorts of reasons got a bad name, but those countries that are ready to take action need to be encouraged to do so. And I would submit those NGOs and those philanthropists also need to take action. Because if government is in retreat, then those of us who are not in government, those of us who are in NGOs, or those of us who are in the corporate sector, or those of us who are in philanthropic foundations, we need to come up with the solutions and start doing it ourselves and rallying those who are ready to be willing to do so, because otherwise we're in a circular firing squad, and that's very dangerous. Thanks very much indeed.
Thank you so much. Zaid.
No, just to touch on David's point, I mean, what he says is fundamentally important. It would have been much better for the General Assembly to have assigned a 2-week negotiation and be done with it than spread it over about 6 months. And again, if you give capitals time under the silence procedure to put the knife in, they'll put the knife in. That's what ministries do. You don't give them the time. You have 1 week, you roll the text very quickly, you gavel it. That's how you negotiate these texts. It's just simple. So to answer your point, you just have to go back to basics. It's almost like we've lost our way and we don't know how to negotiate anymore. You know, it's very simple. There's a technique behind it. Stick to the technique that produces a result. Don't give space for capitalists to destroy text. The main point about negotiating in a multilateral context is that you have to embroider treachery. You know, every diplomat negotiating on behalf of their country at some stage has to unhinge the position from the starting block, from the initial position, from all the red lines that are given to them by all the ministries and all the interagency committees. And they have to be able to travel with the other negotiators to somewhere in the middle and then make the thing stick. And then you go back to capital and explain what you've done. That's how you do it. You can't negotiate multilaterally through capitals. It just doesn't work. So why we keep on doing it is ridiculous. I mean, I just can't understand it.
We need a negotiation school.
Can I just share with you something that happened to me last night?
Please.
This is very appropriate, I think, for this meeting.
With your love budget, I mean,
Not precisely, but
Keep it clean.
in dinner last night, there's this marvelous person who said, listen, pandemics. Climate change is a pandemic, he said. Inequality is a pandemic. The risk of nuclear war is a pandemic. But the worst pandemic that we have to address is the pandemic of the attitude that, oh, that cannot be done. This is too difficult. That, I think, was a very, very important attitude. And I think that is the message. We need to address that pandemic in order to be able to act.
Well, thank you so much, because I'd like to give you all, and coming back to President Sirleaf and to Helen Clark as well, the opportunity to tell this room of advocates, campaigners, people that passionately care about all the issues we've been talking about this morning. Can you give them a bit of hope? We've got some directions of travel here. We're maybe going to have a mega COP of many COPs altogether. We need to relearn the art of negotiation. What would your advice be to advocates in the room about having that courage and bravery to call out what's going on? Could you just give a final word to our people in the room to keep them going?
I think, first of all, we must believe in that we are advocating. I think also one must come to it with a determination of self-involvement. And I think that's where most of the time you find the negotiations fail, because there are those who really do not feel that they are committed to that which is being negotiated. Unless you bring to it your own sense of commitment, then it's difficult. And also, you cannot do it unless you have those with shared values like you to be able to come together and be able to see it as a problem for all. I think we demonstrated that in the case of Ebola. We demonstrated that it's possible to create partnerships, that it's possible for those affected most can be the one that becomes the response, can be the one that take responsibility for it. And I think if you look at world leaders today, we just do not have that kind of strong commitment to see it as a good for all. How do we approach it? I believe there's not enough of the dialogue, not enough of the interaction with leaders for them to realize that they too must be a part, that they do not stand above the problem, but must be able to provide the opportunities and the pathway for others to take the message, for others to carry the story. And I keep saying that today, I believe Africa came together as one in leadership. When we had to solve Ebola, we came together as one in leadership, both the private sector as well as the government, as well as the foundations and the non-governmental organizations. And we saw as our main thing was to have the right information, to communicate it well to people with honesty, and then to make sure that we identify who are the key players and everybody stood behind them in a collective response. I believe that the pact of the future is being negotiated in very, very difficult times, in times when the kind of unity that we saw just does not exist anymore, because multilateralism, global cooperation have all been very seriously affected because of the geopolitical rivalry in the world, because no longer do people see the need for being able to work together to be able to address common problems. And the only way for us to solve that, I see, is to go through what some of the pact has called for, to go for the kinds of reform that we talk about, to make sure if we are going to have an equitable world, you must have participation, more involvement, more contribution from those who are affected by whatever action is taken.
Thank you so much. Helen.
I think there's three things from here. The Pact for the Future's done with its 2 annex declarations, but as I said earlier, the how is undefined. So I think for advocates in the many different areas which the Pact touches on, it's now a question of deconstructing, well, what was the interest signal? You know, what are the hooks? Where do you develop the actual plan from here? It's very easy to do nothing with the Pact for the Future. It just sits there and everyone runs from crisis to crisis, but that shouldn't be what it is. It does signal an interest in wide-ranging reform, but that has to be operationalised. Second thing is that what's in the Pact, a lot of it requires action at the national level, and for the advocates at the national level or subnational level to deconstruct back home, or what does it mean that our leaders ought to be doing? What should our communities be doing? So look for that angle. Then the third point is with respect to pandemics. There is another high-level meeting due in 2026, and you may think that's a long way away. In prep terms, it's tomorrow, right? And you can stagger into it, like New York staggered into the last one with a quite unsatisfactory process. Or you could, through various mechanisms available here in New York, start a dialogue going about what should be coming out of that high-level meeting. So I think those are 3 areas for action.
Thank you so much. Zaid?
Oh, dearie me. No, I mean, I'll stick to the initial point on the pandemic negotiations. And one should also mention, of course, that the IHR was revised and it got its upgrade, which was excellent news. And of course, we have to abide by it. But also just in the context of the negotiations themselves, it's not so much states that negotiate. I think Ellen's point is right. It's the people who so happen to represent states who negotiate. And you can have the same states with a collection of individuals and the text goes nowhere, change those individuals around, same states, same policies, and the text flies through. So the individuals matter. And I don't know whether I can say this. I'm looking at my assistant in the back and see if she nods yes or no. But we, between IMB 8 and IMB 9, we brought many of the negotiators together. And we did this sort of college, experiment, which they may have thought we were childish for doing so. But over lunch, we made them all represent the positions of another delegation. It was quite hilarious, actually, to see it. And amazingly, they all did quite a good job. An African head of delegation represented the United States really well. The United States head chief delegate represented in an Asian country really well, and so forth and so on. So they're beginning to understand their positions. And this traveling together in pain and suffering for 9 AMBs, I think will produce a result at the end. The position of industry is shifting, as all of you know who are following the negotiations. So, it's shifting slowly, but shifting, steadily. And we may get to a result. So I'm hopeful about that. And that would be a real shot in the arm for multilateralism and for the efforts of those who want to see a strong treaty.
Thank you so much. President Santos, advice for the crowd.
Let me again refer to a personal experience that I think is very much needed right now, the way you go about taking the decision, because we need people to stop being indifferent and acting. When I was elected president, I was a war hero because I had been Minister of Defense, and I had been very effective Minister of Defense. I got elected with the highest amount of votes ever in the Colombian democracy. And everybody said, continue the war. You are good at it. Even my family. Don't even think about sitting down to negotiate. All your predecessors have failed. So what sense does it make for you to again try to do it? But there was this very wise advisor, foreign minister, he was a former foreign minister of Israel, Shlomo Ben-Ami. And he said, President Santos, I know you, and I know you want peace. And I know that everybody is saying, don't do it. It's too risky, and it's too costly. And it will be very costly. You sit down with the people you were fighting with, and your popularity will come down immediately. You will lose your political capital. You might even lose your life, like what happened to Rabin or to Sadat. But do the following exercise. Place yourself in front of your grave. And you're about to go into your grave, and you look back, and you ask yourself, if I had taken the risk, if I had taken the decision, how many lives would I have saved? And that was such a powerful reflection that I went to my wife and said, I'm going to do it. And I did it. And that's what we all have to do. What type of world do we want to leave to our children, to our grandchildren, at an individual level, at a government level, at a business level? What type of country are we going to, what type of world are we going to leave our next generations if we do nothing or if we do something?
Thank you so much. David.
Hard to follow that, but actually I would like to follow it very directly. One of the things I've learned over the last 10 years is that it's wrong to think that hope leads to action. It's actually the other way around. Action leads to hope. And so what I would say to all of the advocates, all of the people here, is do something. Focus your minds and focus the minds of decision makers on ambitious but realistic goals. So if you're in my space, 80% of acutely malnourished children today, 45 million of them, don't get helped by the humanitarian aid system. That's why we've created a movement against malnutrition to treat today's malnutrition. Let's build hope by taking action. Early childhood development, we know the investment pays off much more than any other investment, but it's the least funded part of the global system. So really drive and push for action. Yes, there's room for the global texts that Zaid, and I wish he was running these operations because he really knows how to do it. But there's also room for the targeted action that changes lives in the way that President Santos has described. And so take the action to create the hope is my mantra, and I think it's a really important one. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Will you join me in thanking warmly our distinguished first panel? Thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. We're going to shift gears now and welcome our panel 2 guests to the stage. We have an amazing panel for you for our second half. So I'm honored to invite to the stage Dr. Ethel Maciel, Vice Minister from the Ministry of Health, Brazil, Dr. Yonani Rottingen, Chief Executive Officer of Welcome, Winnie Binyamina, Executive Director of UNAIDS, Dr. Chikwe Ikwazu, Deputy Executive Director of the World Health Organization, Dr. Joanne Liu from McGill University and former member of the independent panel, and Dr. Sami Assad, Senior Advisor to the CEO at CEPI. So please all come and take your seats. Wonderful. So for this panel, we're going to be talking to our amazing panelists about work a bit more on the front line, about how you deal with these challenges in your various capacities. And if I can start with the Vice Minister, Dr. Ethel Maciel, could you tell us a little bit about what you hope the main achievements of your G20 presidency will have been by the end of the year? and where there might be work to be picked up and taken forward by South Africa and indeed other partners.
Thank you, Eloise. And good morning, everyone. It's a really pleasure to be here with you. I'm a believer, so I think that in the end of the G20 presidency, we will have these two declarations in place. We are working in a declaration of climate change and One Health approach, which I work personally with this declaration, and I thought was very easy because who don't want a better world? This is like everyone will agree with this. We need a declaration with climate change. That is health is a very important argument to the climate change because the health sector is in the frontier of the climate change. We are the first sector that has the impact, that is suffer the impact of the climate change. So in this declaration, we are working with this link with the next COP30 that we are want to do this link. We start in the COP28 with the Health Day in this conference, and now in the COP29 will be the Health Day either, and in the COP30 we want to be like a big Health Day in the climate change conference because we need to take the health as argument for this. Because sometimes, and Brazil is I would say, example in not a good way at this moment because climate change is a political issue right now in Brazil. We have a very polarized country, as here in US, and people that follow one politician, they don't believe in climate change, and people that follow other, they believe in climate change. So we have right now a very polarized country. And right now in Brazil, we have a lot of, probably we are aware of this, we have a lot of wildfire that people are doing this by themselves. So the Supreme Court right now in Brazil are under investigation more than 50 people that are putting fire in the forest because they want to do this because they don't believe in climate change. So this is the kind of world that we are living right now. And we are in Brazil fighting with this misinformation and disinformation. And probably you already know that the Twitter and X right now, they are cut off in Brazil because they are not under Brazilian regulation. So there is a lot of problem, and this is the way that the social media, unfortunately, are spreading the misinformation, disinformation with no regulations. And we hope with this declaration that climate change and One Health approach that we link with AMR because another thing that One Health approach is like a very abstract, and we took the AMR as a pathfinder to work in the One Health approach. So this declaration will have this link: climate change, One Health approach, and AMR. And we thought that was very easy to finish this, to have this declaration, and we realized that was very difficult. And we decided that in beginning of this September, doing another meeting between the meeting that was in Salvador for the high level, the presidential meeting, and that will be in Rio like next October, and only focus on these two declarations, the climate change and the local production. That was the second declaration that we are working. Because as the other colleagues in the first panel discussed, the pandemic show us the importance of what we need to have some local production in the regions, because if we cannot depend in only two countries with our pharmaceutical components. And we need to have capacity building in the regions. So we are working this 2 declaration, and we hope that in the end we have this done, and South Africa could work with us to have this in the continuum. So thank you.
Thank you. Amazing to hear that combination of climate, health, AMR, One Health all together. Exactly what we need. If I can turn to you, Jonane Ruttingen, as we think about how to manage these different shocks, could you tell us a little bit about how you're thinking about this from the Wellcome perspective, in terms of both how you're seeking to help manage these issues while also laying a stronger foundation for prevention and preparedness in the future as a legacy of your interventions?
Well, thank you, and thanks for inviting us to be here. So for those of you who do not know Wellcome, we are among the largest non-government research funders on health in the world. We have been committed to international focused research for many decades. The COVID-19 pandemic really demonstrated that we are not where we should be, also on the knowledge base and the science. It also worsened the conditions on other infectious diseases because of lack of attention. We had increasing antimicrobial resistance rates because of misuse, because of lack of other treatments for antibiotics. So Wellcome, we are now doubling down definitely on infectious disease threats and continuing our work, in particular antimicrobial resistance. Very important, of course, in the context of the high-level meeting this week. We see that a declaration will emerge. It's good to have consensus on that, but we need action that we heard from the earlier panel. Hope is not enough. The evidence base needs to be stronger. The pipeline needs to be stronger. We have invested probably 300 million pounds over the last decade in trying to improve the pipeline. So probably the biggest investments outside industry. But we also need to have the broader understanding of how can we tackle access issues on antimicrobial resistance from a research point of view? How can we improve infection prevention and control? How can we improve stewardship in hospital settings? Because it's a holistic approach, and that needs to be driven by science. But infectious diseases were only one sort of disease area that was worsened by the pandemic. The other is mental health. It's not a pandemic from a sort of directly view, but it's definitely an increasing concern all around the world. We are also now, I think, probably the biggest non-government funder of mental health research, and unfortunately we have too few friends in that space. We are extending a call for more friends in the space of funding mental health related research. We have established a coalition for mental health investments this week here at the UN General Assembly. But we also, it's not only the challenges. I think we see really important opportunities in the space of mental health. We are at the break of new solutions, but then we need to scale them. We need to make sure that they can be delivered. And linked to the previous panel, that's also about using community health workers, lay people in delivering mental health interventions, because we cannot rely on psychologists and psychiatrists to the scale of this problem. 1 billion people actually need some level of mental health services. And then finally, our third priority for us is climate. And this follows nicely from the minister from Brazil. Climate is also worsening climate-sensitive infectious diseases. And people are concerned about climate. So how can we better really understand the already existing health impacts from climate, both directly due to heat and extreme weather events? And how can we take climate action that will also deliver health benefits here and now? And I think people need to see a here and now benefit. And all of this is driven by science and scientific solutions. So I heard the minister, we all also need to work on the broader issue of trust in science, trust in scientific knowledge, and the solutions that can be derived from science. I need to go very soon because we are launching a climate and health coalition. So I need to apologize to my fellow panelists, but thanks for allowing me to be here.
Thanks for being with us today. Winnie, if I could turn to you, please. So HIV/AIDS is an ongoing pandemic, and even though amazing strides have been made in tackling this disease, outbreaks such as Mpox expose, for example, the numbers of people with uncontrolled HIV who remain at risk. In this era of the polycrisis, how do you think we need to work to keep up progress on individual diseases like HIV/AIDS, while also investing in those broader changes that need to be made to prevent outbreaks and mitigate these broader challenges?
Thank you, Eloise, and good morning, friends. The links between climate, conflict, and pandemics are complex, as others have said, and we don't know enough about them. We need to keep studying them. We have been making progress on HIV/AIDS. We have almost 31 million people today who are living with HIV and who are on treatment. That's about 3/4 of the population of people living with HIV. And this progress is vulnerable to conflict and to climate shocks. Right now, 120 million people are forcibly displaced. Climate change threatens this number to become even 1 billion by 2050. This makes it harder for people living with HIV to adhere to treatment. We see that in the work that we do. It makes it difficult for them to access prevention tools, to access care. Insecurity also spurs the social and structural factors that drive HIV. In many conflicts around the world, we see total disregard of human rights, destruction of health facilities, whole populations displaced, and sexual violence used as a weapon for war. All these are drivers of HIV infection. Then there's the issue of financing. About 54 countries in the world today are facing a fiscal crisis, a debt crisis. Many of these are countries with the highest burden of HIV. So, for example, our data shows that in East and Southern Africa, those countries with the highest burden, a country like South Africa with almost 8 million people living with HIV, these countries are spending 2.7 times more on servicing their debt than on health, 2.7. It's worse in Western Central Africa, where it is 5.5 times more paid to debt servicing than to the health sector. So if that problem of the debt is not solved, if the question of how to raise more domestic revenues is not resolved, we won't be able to make the choices. Countries will make a choice between addressing HIV, addressing the climate shock, or addressing a conflict issue. So it's impossible to manage. Models by Princeton University have estimated that climate change could cause up to 16 million additional cases of HIV by 2050. So we are seeing the linkages now. We must double our efforts to end AIDS, but we must see it as part of a complex set of challenges that all must be addressed. I want to end with an example of Malawi. Last year, Malawi was hit by Cyclone Freddy, one of the worst tropical storms seen. More than 2 million people were impacted, more than 650,000 displaced. The cyclone happened in the middle of a cholera outbreak. Also, the nation was just beginning to recover from COVID. Think about that. There was high burden of HIV, recovering from COVID, and then cholera outbreak, and then a cyclone. Some of the worst hit regions of Malawi are also the ones with the highest HIV prevalence some more than 15%. So up to 90% of people living with HIV in those regions are on treatment. That's our success. More than 90% are on treatment. But 37,000 of them, of people living with HIV, were displaced by that storm. They lost access to their treatment and care. So reconnecting to get your HIV, your ARVs, is not the same as reconnecting to get your high blood pressure pills. It's about your secret about how you live with this disease. There's stigma, there's discrimination. So reconnecting isn't as easy as reconnecting for healthcare for other diseases. So climate shocks also lead to income shocks. We know this as well. And this can lead to high-risk behaviors. We also see this, such as transactional sex, such as sexual assault, such as drug use. This is what I mean about climate shocks, income shocks, and behaviors that put people at risk of HIV. So we're studying this more and more. And the more we see the links, the better we are at defending the gains of HIV. But lastly, the point is that our contribution to HIV is also the platform that can be used to fight and to be prepared and to prevent further shocks. The labs, the health workforce that we have trained, the communities that are sensitized and know about prevention. So this whole infrastructure, the epidemiological expertise on the ground, that's even in communities, all this contributes to managing and preventing other shocks. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Winnie. That leads excellently to Chikwe, and the work of the Berlin hub of the WHO is very much focused on this theme of prevention and collaborative surveillance. How are you adapting in your work to tackle these multiple ongoing threats, such as Mpox, in the context of these different challenges, while also leaving space to address new threats?
Thanks, Eloise. So, yeah, I think Mpox, nothing better defines that intersection between climate conflict and pandemic risk than emergence of Mpox in the DRC. You know, it's the perfect environment. And if we think it's a one-off, it's for sure wouldn't be, because all these risks amplify each other. And so when we think about the response to it, we're very much at the moment focused on the response to the emergent Mpox disease. But there are no conversations about the circumstances that led to its reemergence after 30 years, or its amplification, the emergence of a new strain, and what will continue driving it, the social behavioral factors, the link with HIV, you know, all those other factors, not really in the discourse on the response at the level it should be. But that's an area where, you know, credit to Dr. Tedros and the former Prime Minister, the former President of Chancellor, I have to get the word right, of Germany, right at the peak of the pandemic, where, you know, watching leaders around the world struggle with decision-making, where they had to make decisions every day, huge decisions on what to do with countries, to close, to keep open, to shut down or not, to limit movements. And they realized that our data systems in public health, generally that we use for decision-making, were either completely underdeveloped or completely disconnected from each other. So Winnie, my sister, made the point on the excellent infrastructure for testing, for treating patients with HIV that has developed around the world, funded by PEPFAR, the Global Fund, and local domestic resource mobilization. But the reality is most of that equipment is barely accessible to people working on Mpox, on yellow fever, measles, on all the other viral diseases, not because there's no intention to do so, but because both the donors and the local leaders have never sufficiently driven for a collaborative approach to how we generate, analyze, and use data. And so basically, the concept of collaborative surveillance, which you mentioned, is not a new system, it's not a new model, it's really thinking about decision-making. How can we connect the various data systems that are being collected already for climate purposes, for disease-specific programs, for population dynamics, for movement, for behaviors, and start thinking about how to bring them together more effectively to make decisions. So that's exciting work. It's been going on for a few years now in the hub as we've developed and strengthening that as part of WHO's emergencies program. And we hope happening already, but we'll keep growing on this so that that whole predictive analytic function of an emergencies program is always integrated into the work of preparedness and response for emergencies. And it's not a one-off exercise that you have one disease, then you get a modeling group for Mpox, and then you respond only to the Mpox questions. We want to have a group of experts that are always thinking, talking, analyzing, looking for new data systems and how to link them, both nationally, locally, and globally, in order to then make better decisions and for the decisions then to be linked. And Eloise, I'll start by saying, we learned during the pandemic that, offering our leaders the best opportunity to make the right decision doesn't always lead them to making the right decisions. But still, we know that some of that is outside of our control, right? We live with whatever leaders our electorate choose to decide on to lead them. But our role as public health leaders is to offer them the best possible opportunity to make the best decisions. And literally, that's at the heart of the work we're doing collectively in the hub and linked with critical institutions in every country, normally a national public health agency, but sometimes the Ministry of Health, wherever that function lies in countries. Those are most important partners as we make these efforts. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Chukwe. Joanne, if I can turn to you now. You've spent time providing healthcare in epidemics, pandemics, and indeed in conflict zones. Given your frontline experience with the impact of disease and these complex global shocks, what priority actions do you think we can take at both the multilateral and at the member state level to protect people's health and well-being?
Hello, everybody. Good morning. And so I'm going to disclose my bias. I've been working with Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, for 30 years. So, sorry. All right. Okay. So let's start. Epidemic, climate, and conflict. That's really, honestly, a toxic mix. It's a recipe for disaster. So let me take you in two different types of contexts. Context where we have under-immunized, marginalized population, and context of non-state territories. So with respect to under-immunized community, marginalized communities, remember tsunami in the Indian Ocean? Remember this earthquake? Because a lot of you are young here, but there was an earthquake. I feel old because I was on the field, but 20 years ago, there was this big earthquake, 9.1 Richter scale, with waves of more than 10 meters. Basically, within a few minutes, 230,000 people lost their life. And then the world, it was, during the holiday season, everybody was moved. The world showed up in this region and then tried to do something. MSF was there, of course. And we got there, with our tents, leaky lands, and we got with our buckets and with our paracetamol antibiotic. And guess what? Within a couple of weeks, we got an epidemic of tetanus. Why did we get an epidemic of tetanus? Because people were not immunized. They went back to what they have lost. They wanted to get a souvenir, a picture. They got injured, and then they got tetanus. So we didn't need buckets. We needed sedative. We needed antibiotic, antitoxin, ventilator, ICU, intensive care unit. I had bucket and tents in my. So just to say that we were ill-equipped, and it's because people were not immunized. We have similar issue in 2017 in Cox's Bazar when 700,000 Rohingyas left all of a sudden over a few weeks, fleeing the violence of Myanmar. And then they got in Cox's Bazar and they piled up in this camp. And then I was the one who did a big speech saying, oh, looming threat of cholera. And guess what? We got a diphtheria epidemics. And then again, we were buck naked. We didn't have the right tools. So all this to say that we got caught off guard, and the consequences of children missing on their routine immunization or time bomb of public health emergency. And then we have to chase those 0 children dose and then immunize them. The other thing I want to bring to your attention, it's non-state areas about access. And then the example I want to bring is Syria. And then the issue about Syria is that they were the northeastern part, where it's a non-state areas, and then we had to reach them. And everybody knows that it's been a place where there have been multiple polio and cholera outbreaks over the last few years. Falling groundwater levels, lower than expected rainfalls, drought, reduced flow of Euphrates River, all this contributing to get emerging, we say, outbreaks. So, and then the access to get and immunize people has been very difficult locally, but the government, and then we have to deal with government, but they tax us of helping terrorists, and we do that. We need help as humanitarian workers who are the bandwidth to those labeled groups called terrorists. If we want to do our humanitarian work, we need to be helped in terms of legislation for terrorism. We need to support the 2664 resolution on the humanitarian carve-out for freezing on assets for people who work with those groups. So, and I could talk about Gaza and polio, what happened, and the devastating situation. But here are 3 things we can do in summary. We need to push for immunizing children for routine vaccine, DPT, diphtheria, tetanus, and pertussis. We need to make sure that we push Gavi, that has been telling us for decades that they want to reach out to those 0-dose children. Member states who are financing them, push harder. We need as well to make sure that, humanitarian aid worker get some immunity in working with those groups that we label as terrorists. It's not because we work with groups like this that we have to be punished for what we're doing. And then the last thing, it's about as well the thing about, because I have to talk about it because it was such an issue, it's about if we have another emerging infectious disease and we want to create, again, a humanitarian buffer, please cut down on bureaucracy, please, because the issue about liability and indemnity for a new vaccine and that falls on the humanitarian who's going to vaccinate, it's unfair. It's very, very unfair. So here's my wrap up. Climate is an amplifier of existing problems. We all know that. But we need to stop dragging our feet about the loss and damage of what is related to climate change. We need to live up to the Paris Agreement. We need to stop cutting aids. We need to stop cutting services to people. We need to stop worshiping the market economy with no empathy and no care. Tech transfer, at the very least, for medical countermeasure needs to happen. We need to fund resilient system to absorb global shocks. We need to reduce mass use of fossil fuels. I don't have a love message. I don't have a love budget. I have a love message. We need to be kinder. We need to be smarter. And we need to be lighter on our footprint. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Joanne. Fantastic. Samia, CEPI is focused on the development of vaccines and other biological countermeasures against epidemic and pandemic threats. How does CEPI's work preparing for such threats help strengthen global resilience? And can you also tell us a bit about how you are supporting research in the Global South?
Thank you, Eloise and Pan, for this event and for the great interventions that have come before me. So I'll try and build on some of them and some of what happened before. First of all, CEPI, and I know people don't like Coalition of the Willing because it has connotations of the Iraq War, but in a good sense, CEPI was a coalition of the willing. So Ebola West Africa crisis happened. Very clear over many decades that market failure, because a lot of the sort of seasonal epidemics were happening in low resource settings, that, you know, unpredictability of when the outbreaks happen. It needed really public and philanthropic funding to come early in and de-risk some of the science. So a coalition of the willing set up CEPI and launched CEPI in 2017, specifically to really identify, building on the WHO R&D blueprint, the highest risk pathogens known, but also pathogen X. And we know, unfortunately, our pathogen X came along 2.5 years within CEPI's existence in the form of COVID-19. So coalition of the willing, and I think picking up on David's point, action brings hope. So many of us around the room here rallied against COVID and came together, put egos aside and worked together. So structures that had existed a long time, somewhat competing, and unfortunately we still all compete. And I think that's the key message here. It's these polycrises are interlinked. It's not a trade-off. And we need our politicians to look at pandemics, end to end, right? End to end, from the start of what we need in terms of tools to delivery. Access doesn't start at the end. Access starts at the beginning. So when we talk about equitable access, it is at the beginning. And CEPI puts equitable access in its contractual agreements on research and development at the clinical trial phases right at the beginning. Nobody else does. And that makes it very hard for CEPI. So in terms of tech transfer, we encourage and we facilitate. Can we mandate it? It's very difficult. But this is why the INB is really important. And I really do hope that they rally and they find a way to understand what equity means. And it's shocking when I hear Nigeria asked for Mpox vaccines and it's only 2 years later that they got their vaccines. So let me tell you a little bit about resilience and networks. And so we realized as part of our work during COVID, but also prior, that we needed resilience in every region in the world, right? So we've been trying, during COVID, we built a central lab network that was trying to create assays to harmonize how people sort of evaluated one candidate vaccine against another. And that was open to any researcher anywhere in the world, right, that was working on developing COVID vaccines. We realized that there was manufacturing capacity that was needed closer to outbreaks, and there were capacities already that exist. And what we've done is try to invest in different partners through an open call of interest and some due diligence, and people that were subscribing to our equitable access mission. So we now currently have, I think, preferred manufacturing partners where we're trying to get them ready in case there's another outbreak by practicing on the different new vaccine platforms. So we've got partnership in Brazil. We just announced a partnership with Fiocruz, Biomanguinhos. We have partnerships in Africa. We have partnerships in Asia. So this is part of the resilience agenda. We need to look regionally at having those capacities. And similarly, our clinical trial networks, the clinical trials our partners are conducting are happening where the outbreaks happen. So that is part of the partnership. And going back to your point about how are we looking at the Global South in particular, let me start by saying it's about people, governance, and programs. And so at CEPI, we think we have to have the diversity in people's views internally at the staff of the organization. We've got over 52, I think, countries represented. But the governance is also important. You know, it's not about, you know, funders and beneficiaries. It's about partners at CEPI. And so our governance from our board, and Joanne will know, has a very diverse sets of countries represented, sectors represented, so civil society is also at the table. Industry is not, in terms of not industry that is directly working on vaccines, but a very diverse sort of set of views from the global south, the global north. And also our scientific advice comes from a very diverse set of perspectives as well. So that's really important. You need to embed those views in people and governance. And then our programs, I highlighted that our focus is on developing resilience and partnerships that are equal partnerships. So somebody asked me yesterday about what does a good partnership look like? And it is about joint goals, co-creating the goal. So if we're working on Lassa fever in Chikwe's home country in Nigeria, it is about working with the Ministry of Health, ECOWAS in the West African region, where multiple countries get affected with seasonal Lassa outbreaks, and actually asking them, what is it that's needed? And lastly, it's also about making sure people and communities are engaged in the clinical trial processes and understanding right from the beginning, because you want to make sure there isn't, you're tackling vaccine hesitancy right from the get-go. And Eloise and I have been talking about how do you get civil society really much more engaged early in the R&D processes in terms of educating, understanding what, and making sure the communities understand what we're trying to do. And this is going to be so important now during the Mpox outbreak, where there's a lot of stigma, etc. And then lastly, tech transfer. So we're working with different partners now, firstly trying to look at how we get the existing vaccines for Mpox really suitable for populations at the moment that they're not licensed for, in children or pregnant women. So we're about to launch some trials there. But also looking at the future vaccines. So we have a partnership with BioNTech and the government of Rwanda, where we're trying to look at how we can get a new mRNA Mpox vaccine, but looking at then tech transferring with a partner in the African continent. So a little whirlwind about all the different aspects of the global south and how they need to be embedded, or they are embedded as part of our processes right from the get-go.
Thank you so much. And I'm pleased to say we've got time for a few questions. There's one condition. You've got to have the ability to project your voice. And I will try and repeat what you've said into the microphone. Any takers for questions for our brilliant panel? Show of hands. Don't be shy. Here, yeah, in the front.
And we'll repeat the question. Hi, everyone. I'm Matt Kavanaugh from Georgetown University. So my question is following up on your point about tech transfer. We have now gone through multiple pandemics in which we have hoped that voluntary tech transfer would happen. So far, the record is 0. So how do we get to a place where we're able to rapidly see tech transfer as a kind of norm, rather than as the thing that has to be battled over? I know, Secretary Maciel, you all are kind of putting forward this alliance that might be able to be a pull, because it seems to me that we are in a place where we need leadership and political leadership that resets the assumption about what is acceptable and what's not within tech transfer, because our current strategy really is not giving us what we need, the Mpox example being one. Thanks.
For those at the back that may not have heard, tech transfer on a voluntary basis is not working. How do we get that to become more of a norm?
I will answer with one example. When AstraZeneca was founded, in the contract, they were able to make the transfer, the intellectual property transfer, and this come out with Fiocruz that made contract with AstraZeneca to have the vaccine production or produced in Fiocruz. So I think we need to work with the founders to have this state in the contract, especially for if you took the example of the COVID-19 vaccine, most of them were funding by public money. So they should have some statement saying that this is a public will, this is a public good. So we need to have this possibility. And for this alliance that we are working, this declaration in the G20, we have this opportunity to build this in at least one in the region institution that was able to produce this, because resilience didn't come out in the night for the day. You have to have the capacity, you have to have resource and people that are training to do this. So if the pandemic come out in our door tomorrow, you have to have people in the country that are able to do this. So and to finish this, the example of our universal health system, they took us 30 years to build this. So the example that we have with the flood in the south of Brazil, in 48 hours we have a new hospital that was building. We have all the task force in the healthcare that is in place in less than 6 hours. So we are only able to do this because you have 30 years work to build this. So resilience takes time, and you need to start right now.
Thank you so much, Minister. Winnie.
Thank you. I agree with Minister Trindade. I want to add to this. We are here at ANGA with political leaders. The purpose of an ANGA is to get our political leaders to make political decisions. Here on the panel, we focused a lot on the technical answers to problems, but we need the political answers. And the question that was posed is about leadership. We have global rules that don't work for people, that don't level the ground for everyone to enjoy their right to health. The issue of intellectual property rules is at the heart of this, that companies can make technology, can actually take public goods, public knowledge from universities, develop a medical product, and price it where they want. We learned through COVID that the vaccine that was going to save lives was hoarded by a few companies because they could. They could price it where they wanted. They could refuse to share the technology. A process at the WTO to push for sharing of this technology failed to deliver the result we wanted. Now, having learned a lesson from that, you see countries now trying to stop price gouging of medical products in their own countries, but not willing to do it globally. It's a failure in the global rules. We have to continue challenging this. Today, we have a magical product called lenacapavir in our world of HIV. This is a twice-yearly injectable that can prevent infection once every 6 months, an injection. Imagine what it could do for sex workers, for gay men who are criminalized in some countries, for young girls who are vulnerable to HIV infection in Africa, who hide from parents, who hide from officials. Just an injection once in 6 months can prevent infection. The same ARV is being used for treatment here in America at $40,000 per person per year. Scientists tell us it could come down to a price of $40 per person per year. It's possible. But it won't get there so quickly. The owners of the product, Gilead, have the power to hold it here and deny us from ending this pandemic. So why do we continue failing at each time? Mpox vaccines are sitting in the stores of countries in the north. They don't need it, but they won't send it to Congo. So I think that when we are here, the purpose of the Summit of the Future is to try to reset the rules, to get political will, to start processes of resetting the rules, changing intellectual property rules, so that you can suspend them in order to address an emergency. It's easy, but it doesn't happen. It's political will. So I think that our push for political answers should be stronger. Today, after this meeting, we're having a lunch on UNAIDS with PEPFAR. We are inviting all those who've made it happen, who've innovated and allowed their technology to be transferred to get the ARVs to everyone. And we're also inviting Gilead. Say, Gilead, make us an announcement that you're going to share this. We're going to offer lunch.
Good for you. That's great. And thank you for bringing us back to that importance of political leadership. Do you want to come in? Are there any more questions, by the way? Because we're running out of time. Can I maybe just take another one so people can maybe weave that in for the last couple of interventions?
Curious about connecting this panel with the one before it. I noted in the Pact of the Future, it doesn't mention health that much, but we're in this panel now connecting pandemic, climate, and conflict all together. And I'm curious how you guys think we can better advocate as a health community to leaders at and heads of state and people that look at the whole picture, that these concepts are all connected. Thank you.
Thank you. For those at the back that may not have heard, a note that the Pact for the Future didn't mention health very much, and how can we advocate better globally as health advocates, and asking for the panel's views on that. Sammy, do you want to come in on?
I'll come in just on tech transfer and then maybe on that, and then my esteemed colleagues who are in government who can maybe talk to that a bit better. So just on the tech transfer, again, it is about finding those that will start to do that. And we have found, right? AstraZeneca was mentioned. We also had Novavax who did tech transfer, etc. Yes, with our money at the R&D stages to be the incentive was important, but if they hadn't been willing to, they wouldn't have done it. Outside of pandemics, we've also found partners. I'll call out Valneva, who has the first licensed chikungunya vaccine, licensed first in the US, and we were very worried it would just become a traveler vaccine. So we talked to them and we said, look, where's the biggest burden, chikungunya? It is not in the travelers from the United States. So we worked with Valneva, Instituto Butantan in Brazil, and now we will have some tech transfer to Butantan. Again, they have to be willing to volunteer to sort of do that, right? So pockets of good behavior and creating the right incentives. But what was said was also important. You have to have the capacities to tech transfer too. And I think that's why building resilience and capacities in the different regions around the world is part of that equation and that incentive. And that's really important. On the political will, I am here specifically at the request of my boss to absolutely advocate to governments that you cannot look at climate without looking at health, and you cannot look at the health nexus and climate without looking at the increasing rates of infectious disease outbreaks. So we have to be part of the solution, right? And the mitigation, because 6 years is very scary when somebody says 6 years to reverse And we're seeing more flooding. I mean, again, sorry to keep calling out Brazil, but we saw massive flooding. We have 3 or 4, I think, vector-based or mosquito-based outbreaks of diseases. And that's increasing. We have homegrown malaria in the southern United States. We have dengue appearing. And, you know, we are all connected. So this is, I think, the message that we need to give. And it can't be about trade-offs. It can't be about trade-offs and picking which crisis we need to choose, because you fix one thing here, you haven't fixed the other. So I think that is the message. How you get them to listen, that's a different matter.
We'll talk about that. Joanne, and then Chikwe, and then.
Yeah, well, very quickly, I thank you very much for your question, and I think that it's fundamental. I think that you cannot have a future without health. And then I don't know why it's not emphasized much more than what it is. And then the biggest issue that is there right now, it's the global health workforce. We're short everywhere. Any one of us who work in health right now are asked for extra shift, or asked to do more, and are asked to take no weekends off. So we are in trouble, and I think that we need to raise awareness about that. And then as well, coming from a G7 country, we as a developed country, well, I don't like this word, but high-income country, we have to stop poaching talents from the global south. And then we have to strengthen instead of poaching talents. So we're in trouble, but honestly, no future without health.
Thank you. Chikwe.
Thank you. I'll try and address the question of connectivity. You know, I think as a community, we struggle with complexity. And therefore, we break down complex problems and try and simplify them too much. And I think it's time to embrace complexity, that these challenges are complex and require us to work at those intersections. And it's at those intersections that we will find a solution. So this is really, if you look at climate risk, there's very good data articulating the risks related to climate. If you look at almost every health-specific risk, but if you start looking for data to show how those risks link and amplify each other, you find very little. So really, it's at those intersections that we need to start bringing our data systems together to drive the response that we need. And then I think there are quite a few opportunities now. The pandemic fund is one of them, and the countries have just gone through their first round of proposals. The second one is ongoing. And, you know, as they begin to use the resources, both domestically resourced and internationally mobilized, to try and answer these questions, I do think, and maybe I'm always a glass full kind of guy, that they will start finding that you cannot find the answers by just looking at one direction. And you cannot plug a leaking bucket with one hole, because very quickly another hole will form. And we have to start thinking about this holistically. And this is happening. I'm not saying it as a wish, it's happening. It's not very visible yet. There's a lot we learned out of COVID that we're using for mpox, that we're using for other threats. But, you know, the work that we do in this space is not one that you can bring anyone to cut a ribbon and celebrate a new building or a new bridge or a new medicine. It's the work that happens in the background. So I want to leave my last comment with a bit of optimism about the future, and that there's actually a lot of great work happening by colleagues working very hard at the back ends, and hoping that if we can bring this data together, use it for the advocacy we need with our political leaders and our heads of industry, that we can start moving the envelope and shifting the envelope. But a lot of work to be done.
Thank you so much. We've heard about the technical perspective, but we've been brought back to the importance of political leadership and political action. And certainly, I know that our partners at Resilience Action Network Africa, the independent panel who we've put on this event with today, we're very focused on trying to keep these issues on the top of ministerial leadership agendas. So we thank all of you on the panel for the work that you do in the same regard. And to everybody in this room, we can only do this by taking action. I'm going to echo David Miliband with the action creates hope. We'd love you all actually to be partners of Pandemic Action Network. So you will get information on that on the way out. If you're not a partner yet, fret not, you can join today. So please give me the benefit of giving these amazing panelists a warm hand. Thank you so much for your time in a really, really busy week. We've so enjoyed your wisdom, and really together we are much stronger. And thank you to all of you, and thank you to the amazing team that put this event together. Christine, Courtney, Autumn, Aminata, Carolyn, lots of people. Thank you all, and have a great day.